on vacation this weekend, so or this week, and so I guess I can go ahead and say this now, but please silence your cell phones. If you have anything to present to the Board of Trustees, please hand it to the officer over here, and he would be glad to pass it out to us. Please rise for the pledges of allegiance and remain standing for the silent invocation. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Honor the Texas flag. I pledge allegiance to thee, Texas, one state, under God, one and indivisible. If you will please remain standing for a silent invocation. Thank you. You may be seated. Okay. Let's see here. First on the agenda is audience items. Dr. Dupree? Oh, excuse me. I'm so sorry. Next, we'll have audience items. Each audience member signed up will have 3 minutes to speak. Mr. Rosenthal will keep the time, and he will let you know when you have 30 seconds remaining. First up is Tammy Marino.
Is that better?
There we go.
I feel like a pop singer. There we go. Now you can start my time. So I'm not really sure what I'm going to speak of tonight because I want to talk about the bond and admin's recommendation about the bond, but I have none of that information yet. It wasn't part of the agenda packet. So I'll just speak to what I know as a new member of the Bond Oversight Committee. And that is what you all know, really. We're wrestling with a very giant dollar figure, possibly as high as 1.8. I'm hearing a lot of rumbling in the Bond Oversight Committee and in the community about how we must get it below $1 billion. And I just don't think that that's possible, and while keeping the best interest of our kids in mind. First and foremost, for me, as a theater mom, a choir mom, an art mom, fine arts in our district has been overlooked and undervalued for a really, really, really long time. And I learned at the Bond Oversight Committee last week that anything under $1.5 billion, and we get no updates to fine arts, zero, nothing. So I ask you to consider that very carefully as you're reviewing the administration's recommendations. I think especially in Fort Bend ISD, where we have a lot of highly competitive academic schools, these kids need a creative outlet, and they need that creative outlet to be supported in a big way, in earnest. My other concern about this bond, about whittling down the bond and kind of nickeling and diming it down, is that I believe the recommendation will include, in lieu of a new elementary school in Riverstone, going with elementary school additions at Commonwealth, Austin Parkway, and Settlers Way. But they've completely gotten rid of the core expansion for those schools. And to my mind, that's no better than trailers. I mean, it's maybe a step up for safety because kids will be inside the building, but you're crowding 1,200 kids into a building designed for 770. It doesn't work. I'm a mom at Cornerstone. We have additions. There was no core expansion, and we have a newer building than Commonwealth, and we suffer. We suffer every time there's an event. The kids suffer. Lunch periods start ridiculously early in the morning. It's breakfast time. And the kids constantly have to be at a level 0 just for minimum management in that building because it's too crowded. So I would ask you to strongly consider reviewing that and adding back the core expansions to those buildings if that's the path you decide to take. And finally, I think you're in a tough position. We obviously have to balance fiscal conservatism with the best interest of our kids. So best interest of kids, please.
Thank you, Mrs. Marino. We appreciate you. Next up is Mike Schofield.
Good evening. My name is Mike Schofield. I live in Meadows Place. I have kind of oblique idea here that I think might relieve some of the overcrowding at a couple of the high schools, if not most of them, that has been overlooked. I would request the administration to study in the next school year the number of kids at each high school that might be interested in the CTE Center. I think the percentage might surprise you. And if we do that and it gets finished by then, in spite of local problems we have, I think that would offload a lot of problems or overcrowding at the schools. And I think you'll be surprised by the number of kids that are interested in that. So I haven't seen that factored into a lot of discussion about overcrowding here and there. But perhaps in the next school year, Ms. Martinez and her cohorts can do some sort of survey and study the kids at the schools and try to, I'm sure you're going to do this anyway, try to get an interest level. So thank you very much, and I appreciate y'all's work. I don't know how you do it, but I'm glad you're still getting paid every month, though. So.
Thank you, Mr. Schofield. We appreciate you being here. Next is Lisa Gruskis. Thank you.
Good evening, Dr. Dupree and school board members. I'm a parent of 2 Fort Bend ISD children. One will be entering middle school this year, and the other one will be entering 4th grade.
Ma'am, hold on one
Yes.
second. I'm sorry. Is the microphone on?
Yes.
There you go. Thank you. If you could.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
As you're aware, in response to the school shooting in Santa Fe, Governor Abbott released his school and firearm safety action plan for Texas school districts. This plan includes a recommendation for the expansion of the school marshal program, which allows teachers and other school staff to carry guns inside schools. This also appears to be part of the discussions that are taking place with the Fort Bend ISD Safety Committee. For the safety of our students and educators, I'm urging Fort Bend to not adopt the school marshal program. Guns do not belong in school, which are meant to be places of sanctuary, safety, and learning for children. The presence of guns at schools adds an unpredictable element and puts educators and students at an increased risk. Arming civilians is not an effective way to stop active shooters. Law enforcement officers are extensively trained to handle the chaos and dynamics of an active shooter situation. Civilians are not. Out of 160 active shooter incidents, the FBI found only one instance in which an armed civilian intervention helped, and that was a trained U.S. Marine. The notion that a teacher with less training would hit an active shooter is unrealistic, and there is a risk of unintended injuries to the staff and the students, not only in the event of an active shooter, but just during everyday classroom activities. The American Federation of Teachers, the National Education Association, the National Association of School Resource Officers, and the Major Cities Chiefs Association have all expressed opposition to this plan. Instead of bringing more guns to our campus, we need to ensure that we bring less. Often guns wind up at school because a child has access to guns owned by the parents or other family members that are left unattended. And we've seen a lot of these events recently. There are programs such as the Be Smart campaign, which has been created to reduce shootings and suicides that occur when children get a hold of unsecured firearms. The Be Smart Safe Gun Storage Program is one solution we could promote at our district to increase safety in our schools. Whatever we do, we can't let the narrative of the solution being to arm school officers. As Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon which we can use to change the world. And that is the only weapon that needs to be in the hands of Fort Bend ISD school officials. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Next on the agenda are information items. We are going to start with the capital planning update. Dr. Dupree.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our staff, Oscar Perez and Stephen Bassett, are going to be presenting the recommendation for a November bond this evening. As you know, we spent a great deal of time talking about capital planning this spring. We now have a recommendation for the board on what the bond in November would look like. I would point out that tonight we're communicating this to the board for the first time. The board, as you know, received an email from me over the weekend because we've been working on this diligently for several weeks to get it just right. And so we sent that to you on Saturday. You're going to hear about it tonight. The formal recommendation then would be on the board for board action in August, which means it would be on the August 6th workshop agenda for further discussion, and then for action on the August 13th meeting if the board chooses to call the bond in November. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve to open our presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree, members of the board. So as Dr. Dupree mentioned, we've been hard at work, and we have a lot of information for you. Oscar will take the first slide.
Yes, sir. Well, first thing that I'd like to do is, and before we can start talking about a new capital program, we need to go ahead and let you know how we're doing in the present one, which is Bond 2014. And I want to report that we're doing extremely well. We are in the final phase of the bond with all the projects under construction at this point, and we will have the majority of those projects completed by October of this year, with the CEC being the only one that will lag behind. Now, that one will open in 2019 with the exception of what we call Section E. So that building has a Section A through E, and everything from A through D will be available at the beginning of the, not this school year, but the following school year, and then the Section E will follow shortly after that. At this point, we don't have that timeline because, as you well know, we're still dealing with the exhumation of the bodies, and we won't be able to know until we get that done, and then we'll schedule that out. But the bond is going extremely well. We are under budget, and we intend to stay in that manner.
Okay, thank you, Oscar. So we last met June 18th. And so in a little over a month, since that time, we presented a plan of over $1.7 billion, and we gave you all kinds of tax rate scenarios. I think you were tired of looking at those by the time I was done. But since we met last, we've had one-on-ones and with some of the trustees, gotten feedback from them. We've had 2 meetings with their Economic Development Council, and we've had 2 meetings with the Bond Oversight Committee and received feedback from other stakeholders. And so they've helped formulate a plan that we're going to get into more detail on. But our recommendation is for a $992 million bond plan with a 3-year. So it's a 3-year bond with a plan for the Phase 2 election in 2021. So we'd have an election in November of this year, and then another election in 2021, with an expected tax rate of $1.35, which is 3 pennies higher than our current tax rate. But it's just 1 penny higher than what we had a couple years ago after we had the drop and swap on the debt service rate. So we'll get into more detail on that. Before I turn it over to Oscar, though, we just want to touch on some of the points as to why this is such a critical bond for the district. First of all, it supports profile of a graduate, and so there, as you know, there are updated education specification levels by level. Specifications by level, high school, middle school, and elementary. So all those come into play with the capital plan that we have. We have needs for more safety and security. We're modernizing our technology, and then we're working to update district-wide educational adequacy. And so that's primary. Also, our facilities, our average age is 25 years. And based on the debt information we've shared before and what we've seen, we have underinvested in our facilities in the past several years, and so we're trying to make that up, and of course it addresses enrollment growth. We are expecting significant enrollment growth, and that's why we do need new campuses.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. So as you can see, the last time that we reported, we were looking at a almost $1.8 billion bond. Hearing from the board, hearing from the BOC and the Economic Development Council, and other stakeholders, we understood that we needed to go ahead and look at a means of being able to get the work done, but being able to do it at a manageable level. And so we had some a lot of discussion on how to break this up, and we decided that the best way to go about it would be to go in a two-phase approach, as Steve just alluded to. So what we did was we went ahead and we looked at the priority 1 deficiencies, and we saw how those lined up within our original plan. Our original plan was a 6-year plan, and we saw how that was scheduled out, because, you know, alongside looking at just what the capital plan was, we're also having to look at the schedule to see, you know, how can we go ahead and get this work done in 6 years. So we had already, you know, looked at a schedule, and it gave us an opportunity to be able to break this up into 2 phases without having any impact into the schedule as far as our new construction. When, you know, we anticipate having those buildings open, they fall, you know, right into place. Along with that, the other thing that we did was we went ahead and started refining, you know, what all of the needs. And what we found based on the facilities master plan and what the board approved was we found that we had some redundancy. And some of those redundancies had to do with part of the 2014 bond phase 3 work that had work going on that we were showing, because when PBK did the assessment, they picked up some things that we went ahead and identified and said, no, that's in 2014. So those amounts were pulled out. We also, with the rebuild of Meadows and Lakeview, we had life cycle deficiency work in there that we were able to back out of that. And then also working with the chief and what the feedback he's getting, we looked at removing the metal detectors from the program at this point. The other thing that we looked at was we went ahead and looked at the green initiatives, and what we have all of that included in all of our new buildings. So we felt that we could go ahead and back out that $10 million from that, and because we're going to include it in all of our renovations and additions. And then we also went ahead and backed out the contingency. We reduced the program contingency that we wanted to include from the 17 to 10 million total, 5 million per phase. So when we look at the construction detail,
I can't hear him. I don't understand what he's saying.
what you can see,
Mr. Perez, excuse me.
yes,
I'm sorry, I wasn't following that that last slide or the information that you were presenting. You were backing out $10 million. You were backing out another $10 million. I don't see where you, maybe I didn't hear the description enough. So I'm sorry, I wasn't following it because you were on the slide.
yes, ma'am. So at the bottom of the slide where you have energy initiatives, those initiatives are included in all of our new construction and additions. And so we went ahead and felt that we could back out this 10 million and still go ahead and look at energy initiatives, whether that be solar or, you know, different items that we could bring forward. And actually in our new construction for a middle school down the road, we were looking at the possibility of that being a net zero. So we're definitely looking at addressing that in that area. And then overall, we had in the capital plan originally 17.3 million for program contingency. As you recall, in the 2014, we started with 0, and we had to kind of build that up. And we just feel that it's prudent that we have some contingency from the onset. But we felt that we could reduce that to 5 million per phase. So that's a reduction of 7.3 million in that area.
Okay, thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Perez. We'll ask questions at the end.
Okay, so as I said earlier, as we broke this out, we were able to go ahead and include the new construction and additions in phase 1 that were already scheduled in the same manner in the 6-year plan. The one difference that we have in this is that we are including for the middle school In phase one, because of when that school is required, we're including design, some civil and site utility work for $10 million in phase one, and then we would come back in phase two for the remainder of the money. We would not include everything because we would not be building that school in the phase one area. As far as the high school, that we're keeping all of the money in that, because for the high school, in order to open in 2024, we would have to go ahead and start all the design work early enough, and then construction actually starting in November, December timeframe of 2021 to be able to get that school open on time, because a high school is a good 2-year time build in order to get that done. So those are the main things I want to emphasize on that. And as I said before, our anticipated construction timeline that we had when we first came to you with a 6-year plan does not get affected in this 2-phased approach.
Oscar, it might be good to go ahead and talk through which schools are in phase two.
Yes, sir. So the phase two schools are elementary school 54 and elementary school 55, which are down in the Sienna area. And then we're looking at the middle school, as I said, will have design in phase one, and then the construction in phase two. That location is yet to be determined. We're working on land plan for that. And then the other two are natatorium and the bus terminal, and at this point, those are to be determined. We know it's going to be in the Zone Z, which is in the same general area, because what we're looking at here is we're looking at a practice natatorium. So we want to have one on each side of the district. And then we're looking at a bus terminal to help relieve Lake Olympia. And a lot of our transportation needs obviously go into the Sienna, Riverstone area. And so it would be somewhere in that general vicinity that we would be looking for land.
Oscar, I know we've also received a few emails on elementary 53. Would you go ahead and address that, Riverstone School?
Yes, sir. Elementary School 53 in Riverstone, we are actively looking for land. We have, that one is in phase one, and we have $45 million that we have budgeted for that at this point. In the event that we cannot purchase land, then we would be looking at 3 additions that would be at Commonwealth, Austin Parkway, and Sellers Way Elementary School. And those are budgeted at a little over $26 million, but that would be coming out of that $45 million that is budgeted for the elementary at this time. And in the additions, at this point, the core is not included in those additions. So it could be something that we could incorporate between now and the time we call the bond, but at this point, the core are not included in those additions, core expansion. The funding would be from the difference between this $26 million and the 45 that is budgeted for the elementary school at this point. Because an elementary would be $45 million, and the 3 additions, we are anticipating 26.1 without core additions at this point. So we would have to look at that cost, and it would have to come out of that.
Okay, so you last saw this slide, but I included this because I changed it up a little bit on the next one. But the purpose of this was to show, since we adopted the bond, we started off with outstanding debt of about $844 million. And so while we've issued $331 million of debt since this past May, we're still only at $963 million for our outstanding debt. So this is just a breakdown in terms of how that happens. So you can see, as we go every year, we are making payments. We're paying down our debt as we collect our taxes. Then we have the impact of refundings, and then you can see the new issuances there. So This was just to do that math for you so you could see how we put this together. And so this is the kind of information that I'll use to project. Once we finalize a final number for the bond, we'll do a projection for what we think our outstanding debt would be at the end of that term. So speaking of that, whenever we were going through the slides and we got some feedback from others, I thought, okay, well, go ahead and project out what you think we would have. Now, this is a projection based on the 6-year at 1.25 billion, but we're recommending less than that now. But we were calculating that if we did a $1.25 billion bond, we'd end up with outstanding debt in terms of about 1.6 billion, which still compares favorably with some of the other districts in our area. It looks even better on a per student basis. So, and this isn't all of our statewide peers. We're just trying to keep the number of slides down to the minimum, and we're just looking at our Houston area peers. But right now, our outstanding debt per student is at $13,000, and using that projection that we had before, if we were at the 1.6 billion, we would anticipate that bringing our outstanding debt per student up to under 20,000, closer to 19,000 per student, which still would compare favorably to the districts the way they are now. We know that the districts that are to the left of that red line are going to continue to issue outstanding debt and have bond elections. Right now, we're at the 2.6% of our outstanding value. That's where our debt level is right now. We'll go through the calculations to project this out. There's so many variables that go into projecting this one, and so once we do come up with a final number, we'll project this out so the folks will have some comfort level on this projection. So this is a new slide for you, and so what we have here is a number of districts throughout the state, and each one of those sections is a bond election that they had. So these are looking at all these successful bond elections since 2005 and going all the way through 2018. And so you can see we're at the top there with our 2007 authorization, 2014 authorization. And so since 2005, we're under $1 billion in investment. Pretty much all of the districts are in excess of $1 billion since that time. Looking down the list, Cy-Fair is over $2 billion in investment using just the 2007 and 2014, and they're going to be going out very soon with a number I think that I've been told is going to be north of $1 billion. Katy, counting the 2006 through the 2017, they're north of $2 billion, and then of course Northside, which has over 100,000 kids. So if you look at this, I mean, you can make the case with our debt levels and the investments we've been making on a capital basis since this time frame in 2005. We do think that we've underinvested in our properties.
I just want to tag on and reinforce what Steve is saying, because this slide is a very telling slide in Fort Bend ISD, because we have always been, for my 24-year affiliation with the district, fiscally conservative, as prudent as we can be. But our buildings are now aging significantly, and the underinvestment is starting to really show. And so the things that you're reading about, the things you're hearing about, this tells an excellent case for why we need really every penny of this bond. But again, we're continuing down a conservative path by splitting it into two, but we think it's all ultimately required to really get us where we need to be.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So comparing our tax rate and how it compares to all the most of the folks in the metro area, we're at $1.32. If you want to look at some of the main benchmarks that we have, Cy-Fair is at $1.44. Katy is at $1.52. When you compare our tax rate to theirs, we're certainly well below that, and it's just a reflection of the investments that have been made over time. So we're benefiting from that. When it comes to what we need to spend as a taxpayer, but it is impacting the school district. So I'm going to get into some new scenarios with y'all. So we did, based on the feedback we got, we wanted to look at scenarios both with and without any deferment of principal, and so that's really the main difference there. And then also we're looking at, with a shorter time frame, having new money issuances through 2025. That's when the high school would be totally closed out. Everything would be paid off by that time. And then also just, I just want to remind everybody, when we're looking at these scenarios, back in 2007, whenever the projections were made for bond 2007, the district at that time said, they may raise the tax rate as high as 11 pennies. And at that time, there were no pennies used. No pennies were added for bond 2007. So the biggest assumption for the scenarios that we're going to go through really have to do with our change in certified taxable value. And so you've seen this slide before. And so really, what we're focusing on are the scenarios of averaging out at 5%, growth during the planning time frame, or 3%. So if you look at the most conservative 3% growth, if we were going to issue level debt, and so have no deferment of principal, and with the 3% scenario, we'd be needing we're projecting that we would need as many as 35 cents to add to the tax rate. Okay, so that's a 9-penny increase. And so you can see how that compares. That 35 pennies is the top bar going across, and the 26 cents where we're at now is the bottom bar. So you can see, we definitely would need to have a significant tax rate increase with those planning scenarios. If you looked with, doing deferral of principal during that time, you can see the impact that would have on the tax rate. Really, it's the deferment of principal over that whole time is worth about 3 pennies. Okay, so that's the way the math works out for that. But we'd be able to handle those overages in those couple years, with debt balance and the refundings and such that we have. But so that's a comparison of the 32 pennies versus the 26 pennies. If you look at the 5% value growth, okay, over the 10-year time with level principal, we think the tax rate would need to go up as high up to 32 pennies, which is a 6-cent increase. Okay, so it's, a lot of all the same information there. So you can see how that 32 pennies compares to the collections at 26 pennies. And then you can see the next one, if we did deferral of principal over that time frame, with property tax collections, we would need 3 pennies, at least 29 cents, to be able to manage the outstanding debt. And so you can see how that compares to the 26 cents. So that's why I had in the first slide to expect, a tax rate increase as high as 3 pennies. I mean, we would need those pennies, unless we really had value growth way above 5%, then we could back off that in the future. But I think it's prudent to say that we would need to have at least 3 pennies. So we summarize those 4 charts into this table. If we had a bond election in the 990 range with value growth at 3% and 5%, you can see there the table without principal deferment, we could need as many as 9 pennies with 3%, 6 pennies for 5. With principal deferment, 6% and 3%. Okay, so and then also, that shows a 3-penny increase. And just to remind everybody at the bottom that we did have just last year we did have a 2-penny reduction. So that increase under that bottom right number would be a penny. And so our tax rate projection, for the bond, our 2016 tax rate, is $1.34 in 2017, $1.32. With the swap and drop, and so we're projecting in the future that we would go up to $1.35. So there's a lot of information. We try to keep the number size down to a minimum, but we'll be happy to take any questions you guys have.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett and Mr. Perez. We appreciate the presentation. Mrs. Haliger, you have a few questions? Can you turn on your microphone?
Thank you for your presentation. I was a little confused. I think the 2 slides looked alike, so thank you for getting me straight there, Jim. So I guess I'm a little confused. I was under the impression that one of the reasons why we had all the conversations that we've had over the last few months, it was get this done, put the dollars into the bonds, because we were concerned about some laws that might impact us.
Yes, I apologize for not addressing that whenever I outlined the 3-year versus the 6-year. So we talking with our friends in Austin, talking with them about what they expect to see, in the legislative session. If there is an actual bill, that would be filed to limit the approval of bonds to a time when you have over 30% of your voter participation. Again, you can only do that in a presidential year. And so that if that was discussed and passed in the 2019 legislative session, which is coming up, okay, then the way we would react to that is we would say, okay, that's fine. We have a 3-year plan, and our intention was to go out for a bond in November of 2021, but we'd be able to react to that and have an election in 2020 if need be. Okay, so I would see us doing that under that scenario. The next time that we'd be in a situation where, you know, if they didn't do it in 2019, the next time they would do it would be in 2021. So then what would happen then? Because the next presidential election wouldn't be until 2024, after talking with, you know, our folks at Mokasey and others, they don't see them passing something like that and not giving any kind of grace period, not giving districts any time to react. Because of the fast growth school districts and all the buildings that they would need to do within a 3-year time frame, they wouldn't have any of the ability to finance it if they weren't able to pass bonds in the 2022 year, okay, or even the 2023 year. And so we anticipate that other times where they've had grace periods, they would say, okay, if they pass a new rule, new law in 2021, that they you could have an election that May, or you could have an election that November. That they would at least give that much grace period. But whenever, you know, Curtis Colwell in particular that I was speaking with, exchanging emails with at Mokasey, he just said, you know, yes, it's likely. I mean, it could happen, but a lot of people don't think it would happen. But if it does, there accommodations will be made. But he wouldn't, and having been a superintendent for a long time, he wouldn't let that impact the immediate bond planning that we're doing. And so, taking that information, we were comfortable with making this proposal. And so it's a little bit different than the last time we spoke.
I would add the other part of the conversation is in preparing in all the discussion we've had, and our job as trustees, you know, a big part of the decision making is addressing your risk and managing your risk. And when we face the reality of a community who might, if they were asked to pass a bond that is 3 times the size of the last largest bond we've ever had at 1.5 or 1.7, we decided we felt the risk we wanted was to bring that down and not have that local risk. We would rather accept the risk that our state legislature will keep our best interest in mind in the end, that there's political saber rattling taking place, but at the same time, even if they do make a change to these laws, as Steve said, there's historically always been a phase-in. So we decided it was a better risk to accept that side of it and do the 2-3 years rather than 1-6 and trying to accept that risk in the community right now.
Thank you, Mr. Bassett and Dr. Dupree. I understand that approach. I think it would also have made some of the decisions that we voted on a little different, me personally, because I felt like I was pigeoned into this box to make certain decisions because we had a bit of a paranoia, you know, a bit of fear because of this new legislation, that we decided on some things that technically can still be decided on in 2021, in which we voted on last time. So, but good presentation. I need to still mull over some of this because I'm still catching up with this. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Hellier. Mr. Rice.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine, and thank you, Mr. Bassett and Mr. Perez, for an excellent presentation. I've got several questions here I would like to ask you. So I believe that if we split the bond into two bites of the apple, as you presented, does that also allow our appraised value to increase during that same time period? And would that have an effect if we went out for the second bond of minimizing the increase in the tax rate at that time?
Yes, sir. There's certainly the chance of that. And so, you know, definitely whenever we would be preparing for bond 2021, we would have 3 more years of clarity, you know, with regard to where our appraised values are.
Okay. And I noticed you had energy initiatives. I believe you called them green initiatives before. And can you explain to me what those initiatives were and why they were removed? You said they're included in the new schools. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, sir. Part of what we had in that, we had, some solar panels. We were looking also at the possibility of some geothermal for air conditioning. That is not included in the others, but solar panels can be included in there. We're having, with all the new, the changes in code and everything, our buildings are just becoming a lot more efficient than what they were in the past, and we feel that we can go ahead and look at systems that will take us to the next step. And one of the things, as you've mentioned before, being looking at net zero down the line. We've started those conversations with our architects and MEPs to see what that would look like, and so that we could include those type of initiatives within our new construction.
Are the new schools going to be LEED certified?
Yes, sir, they will.
Okay, good. Have we considered the use of performance contracting to be used in conjunction with the bond to perhaps attack some of the energy-consuming systems in schools that are not included in the bond, such as retrofitting some of the lighting with LED lighting, maybe putting some photovoltaic panels there, other things like that, that performance contracting that could pay for itself?
Yes, sir. Actually, that was a lot of the conversation that we had as we were trying to pare this down into two phases, and as we had to, in some cases, move lighting projects into the phase two. The conversation was just that, what you just spoke about. And then the other part of it is that we're also looking at having a component within this particular program where we can have some work that we can do with job order contracting that we can jump on quickly and get done, instead of throwing it all in with a large construction package that delays it, further down the line. Because we are in grave need with our MEP systems and getting some work done quickly. And so we're definitely looking at all of that.
Including performance contracting?
Yes, sir.
Okay, that's probably a viable way to go to help minimize our costs. I realize the cost of undertaking that, it's the cost of money. But if it's a way, even if it costs us a little bit more money in interest, if it still gets done and it still can pay for itself with energy efficiency, that might be a way to minimize the overall amount of a bond program. It's
Yes,
just
sir.
another tool.
And reduces operating costs.
And reduce, and the money that we save, once those systems are paid for, the state and the federal government can't tell us how to spend that money, and it goes straight to the bottom line. We can use it to hire teachers. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
I did want to, Mr. Bassett, could we look at slide 16?
Yes, sir.
When I look at that slide, I see that for the last 22 years, our change in certified net taxable value has been above 2.5% for 20 of those years. And it has been above 4% for something like, let me see, 2, 3, 4 of those years. So the vast majority of the time over the last 2 decades, our property tax values are well in excess of the 4% proposed cap in revenue growth that Senator Paul Bettencourt proposed in the 85th session, and well above the 2.5% cap that Governor Abbott is talking about. I tried to ask Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick at a breakfast last Wednesday if Governor Abbott's proposed 2.5% cap would be applied to our INS tax rate as well as the M&O tax rate. I was unable to ask that question. But I think this slide is a very good indicator of the damage that a proposed 2.5% cap on revenue property tax growth would have for our district. And so if we say that we have underinvested in our facilities for the last 20 years, and someone said, Jim, why do you need a bond in order to replace roofs and MEP systems? How come you haven't been saving up money for that? I would say because we don't have the money to save. And the last time you presented a budget program to us, I believe that we have 3 months in our fund balance. And it's not all cash. Some of it's prepaid and so forth. And that is the recommendation of the TEA. It's not my recommendation, although I'm a conservative guy. It's a recommendation of the TEA to have 3 months of operating costs in our fund balance and in our own rainy day fund. And so I just really want everybody, I hope everybody can understand that we really don't have a way to save money in a growing school district and hire teachers and give teachers the training they need and give them the raises that they need and still plan to replace a roof. For example, a roof at an elementary school, I think that's probably worth $1 million. Is that right, Mr. Perez? And a high school might be double that?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
And so we do have some money in our fund balance for things that go wrong, which we've had a couple of things last year. But we don't have money for wholesale systematic replacement of roofs and chillers and cooling towers. We don't have that money, and that's why we have to include it in a bond. So it's just like my old house that I lived in for 32 years. Over time, I had to replace the HVAC system twice from the original. I had to replace the roof twice. I had to replace the windows. I had to upgrade the restrooms and the kitchen. I had to do some foundation repair, and I had to paint. All the same things that we have to do too. Some of those were planned and budgeted for, and some of them weren't. And okay, so I just don't want to belabor that, but I think this is really a good slide that illustrates the damage that a proposed 2.5% cap on property tax would do, not just to Fort Bend ISD, but to every single school district in the state of Texas. And at the end of the day, we're the Fort Bend Independent School District. We are our own political independent subdivision. I don't understand why the Texas legislature should be telling us what to cap our property tax value at. They already tell us what we can set our M&O tax rate at, and I think they're messing in our business, and they need to stay out of it. Next, slide 17 is a summary of debt with remaining issues. That's 3% property value growth over 10 years. But what is the difference between slide 17 and slide 18?
So slide 17 is with assuming that we have level principal. That means we're not deferring any principal. And so the gray bars are lower at the beginning, and some of it gets pushed into the other years. And so that's the difference. It includes deferment of principal to take advantage of our outstanding debt structure that we have in order to minimize our tax rate.
Okay. So that would require an increase of 6 cents?
Yes, with the 3% scenario.
And that's a pretty conservative, a 3% property value growth over 10 years is pretty conservative.
Very conservative given our history of growth.
And what would that do? So for 5 years, we would just service the interest on the debt.
Right. We wouldn't be in a situation where we'd be capitalizing interest. There are other districts that do that, but we would defer interest. But that's the way this is modeled. I mean, depending on how things go with our bond program and as we issue new debt, we can make decisions at that time whether or not we would defer some principal, none, or all of it for 5 years. And so, all of that will remain to be seen. But it's really difficult to model various scenarios within that. So we're just showing you what that looks like with 5-year deferral of the debt versus no deferral of debt.
So we could handle a $990 million bond with a 6-cent increase to the INS tax rate.
If you assume 3% growth, I mean, I personally think that 5% is a more realistic number, and so that's why I had in the very first slide to expect a tax rate of $1.35, which would be a 3-penny increase, and so that's the result of slide number 20, where you would have deferral of principal and with 5% growth. And so if we have more than 5%, I mean, I'm very optimistic for the coming year. If you drive around the district and you see everything that's happening with all the homes and even the commercial properties, and then after that, I mean, we'll see. But we know that the economy right now is booming. So I don't think that given our growth, that a 5% is an overly aggressive scenario. It would be my hope that if we average that, we would be able to minimize any deferral of debt by because of the benefits of the refundings that we'd have, and then also the benefits of the variable rate debt, which isn't included in these numbers.
Mr. Bassett, if we magically pass the bond today, we would not need to increase the INS tax rate all at one time, would we? Oh,
no, sir. No, sir. We would wait until we would need it based on the whenever we would issue the debt. One of the things in there that I said earlier on this slide, I think it was on slide 16, we would continue continuing the commercial paper program. One of the things that I think would really help us out, if given how well that program's gone, and we've saved over $6 million so far, one of the ideas that Roel had, he said, if you guys increase that to 150, you'd really be able to manage the rate better. And I said, well, why is that? And he said, if you have 150 million as a commercial paper, what we'd be able to do is we'd be able to minimize the overall number of transactions that we have. And so fewer transactions would result in less issuance costs. And then also if we were combining outstanding commercial paper with a refunding, for example, we'd be able to have a significantly larger transaction, which would attract many, many more investors to the deal, which would also drive down the overall interest cost. And so that's something that we'll be talking about in the future as well.
Well, I'll just add this. I was going to save it till the end, but since 2014, we've made principal payments of $145 million, and we have saved $67 million, almost $68 million due to refunding or refinancing of existing debt, and the commercial paper has saved us $1 million.
Yeah, that was actually the issuance of the commercial paper, and so the interest savings aren't necessarily shown on here. So we've saved over $6 million in interest savings, and the interest savings aren't part of that outstanding debt slide.
Well, a lot of the good financial position that we're in is because of your careful stewardship of this bond since you've been here, and also in this board and previous boards who have come before us in the past, because when you look at the slides that show our tax rate compared to some of our peers, we still have a very low tax rate, and the amount of debt that we have per pupil, contrary to what some in Austin say, is still very low compared to our peers.
Yes, sir.
So it's pretty clear to me that Fort Bend ISD is running a very conservative, tight financial ship. But I did want to ask you one other comment, and that was when you were talking about the 2007 bond, you indicated at the time the district said they might have to increase the INS tax rate by 11 cents, and yet we did not. And would it be fair to say that we did not because of the appraised value growth that we enjoyed in the district that allowed us to do that?
That's my best guess. I mean, I wasn't here when that assumption was made, and I haven't gone back to look at the math and look at the assumptions. But the value growth since then, has been significant. There were a couple of years of lower, and that's why that slowed everything down. And but the high value growth definitely would account for that.
And my last comment is, if on slide 22. It shows the 2016 tax rate of $1.34, and in 2017 it went to $1.32, and that's because we took advantage of the remaining 2 golden pennies on the M&O tax rate, which was yielded, I believe, $11 million in sustainable funding that allowed us to give the teachers a raise. And we lowered the INS tax rate 4 cents. So we could have just kept the INS tax rate up there, but we returned that savings to our constituents. And if we follow your projected tax rate of $1.35, and we pass a bond in November of this year, our combined ad valorem tax rate will be 1 penny higher than it was in 2016 with a $990 million bond. That's something to be pretty proud of. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. Mr. Rosenthal.
Thank you. Just to follow up on that, that assumes a 5% growth, right?
That's assuming the 5% growth,
Got
sir.
it.
That's
Got it.
correct.
Okay. Just to follow up on a concern that we heard earlier. I've looked through all these projects here, and I do see some of the fine art stuff that are in the first phase. But is there a way we can get some, kind of a gross number or a net number of what we're putting into fine arts in each phase of the proposed bond?
Yes, sir, we can get that for you.
Because I do see a lot of stuff in phase 1 where there's auditorium work and whatnot going on in a lot of the schools. So is there anything else that you can discuss that pertains, to fine arts and whatnot? I see a lot of athletic spending as well, so.
Yes, sir. So what we did with fine arts is we went ahead and sat with James Drew. We went through and we asked him which were the ones that had the greatest need. And so those are the ones that we went ahead and concentrated on for phase 1, and then we deferred the others to phase 2. In the athletic side, we went ahead and sat with athletics, and we did the same thing. And so we went ahead and deferred some of the turf into phase 2, specifically for middle schools. We kept turf in the first phase for the high schools. And then as far as the stadiums, we looked at the stadiums need some structural repair that needs to happen before we really do any modernization because they're deteriorating, and we need to go ahead and get those under control. And so that's what we included in the stadiums in phase 1, and then the remainder we deferred to phase 2. But we actually have the dollars. I don't have them here in front of me, but we definitely can provide you that report. We have all the breakdowns in any manner you may want to look at.
That would be good to see. And I will tell you that Coach Brantley would love to see that the restroom stuff at Elkins moved up to phase 1. So, and I'll tell you why offline. But okay, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. Tossan.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. So I want to, first of all, say thank you guys for, I know a lot of work went into this for a lot of weeks, not only crunching numbers, but meeting with groups to try to get a feel for what our community will tolerate. And frankly, that's a lot of what this is about, is what our community will tolerate. I think several of us said a couple of board meetings throughout this process that the last time we went out for a bond in 2017, we basically cut that bond in half, or at least reduced it significantly, because we felt like our community could not tolerate the higher bond. And so I recognize that that's what we're doing now, that's we're trying to make sure that whatever we put out there is going to pass, because it's critically important, not just for facilities, but for our kids. And so if it doesn't pass, then it significantly impacts the way we educate children. So I appreciate that. I have some concern about some concern about it, because I know last time we cut because we didn't think the community would pass it, and then we have a lot of things that haven't gotten done in the past several years, and now we're facing that again. We talked about the $360 million deficit that we're facing because we didn't do the work last time. So I'm going to express that I have some concern about that. On the other hand, we're switching from a 6-year plan, sort of, to a 3-year plan, but not really, because we have a phase 1 and a phase 2. So when I first saw this presentation, the first thing that I thought of was, this is really what we knew all along, that planning for 6 years is really difficult. And we talked to the community some about that, because we had our Band-Aid groups and all our groups come together. And I feel sort of like Ms. Helliger, sort of like we were pushed and steamrolled into doing things or planning for things that we all know from experience, and you all know from experience, it's just not that easy to do, particularly in a governmental entity. It's just not the same as it is everywhere else. And so from that standpoint, I feel like it's a better decision, because it gives us 3 years to do the things that we absolutely need to do now, and then we can see where we are in that 3 years and make sure that our plan is sound and that we're not just going out for a 6-year, $1.7 billion bond when things could change along the way. So I know there's no question in that, but we've only had a couple of days to digest this information, and that's kind of my thought process as I've digested it. Is at the end of the day, I feel like this is probably where we all knew we should have been at the beginning, on the one hand, but on the other hand, I know this board in particular wants to make sure that we're doing absolutely everything we can to invest in our facilities and invest in our kids, because we've gone, as those slides show, way too long not doing that, and it's time for us to do it. So that's just my commentary at the outset. I'm with Mr. Rosenthal. A lot of the questions I sent in to you guys today were specific questions, so I'm not going to sit here and ask them in an open meeting, but I had specific questions on why certain things were in phase 1 or phase 2 as opposed to phase 1. I'm specifically focused on safety and security. When do we know when we're going to get the recommendations from the committee? The Safety and Security Committee. Hey, Chief, I didn't even see you sitting there.
Okay, so the Safety and Security Committee is about to be in the process of coming to a consensus. There's going to be a survey going out to them. July's been a tough time to get everybody together.
Yeah.
We had a very low turnout at the last meeting, but we feel like we're winding down our work there. So we'll come to a consensus. My goal is to get back to you in August and to give you those recommendations.
Okay. Yeah, I think that would be important, something important for me to see, because I want to make sure that we're including everything in this bond that is being recommended, because safety and security is going to be at the top of my list, and I'm sure some other board members as well. So
I agree with you. A lot of the things that we're doing in the Safety Advisory Committee focuses on preventive measures. A number of those aren't bond related.
Okay.
So while the list looks a little short on safety and security, a lot of the things that we're talking about don't have anything to do with a bond. We wouldn't be able to use bond money for that. So
well,
just
that's
so
good
you know.
information. So thank you for that. And then some of the questions I had related to like cameras in the classrooms and things like that. I just special ed cameras and other security cameras. So I just want to make sure that we're, you know, why decisions are being made to put those in specific phases. I like Mr. Rosenthal, and you know, I went through the list, and just want to make sure that schools that have been put off in the past aren't going to be put off again. And I know it's still a 6-year plan. At least we're just doing it in 2 phases. So I just want to keep that in mind. Make sure schools that we've told repeatedly are going to get things, are getting the things that they need. My other question is around the expansions at Commonwealth and Austin Parkway and Settlers Way. And you talked about that if we did the additions and that the expansion of the core could be funded with the additional $45 million that's budgeted for the new elementary school. Did I understand that correctly?
It could be funded with the difference between the 26 million and the 45.
Right. Okay. So my question is, how and when does the board weigh in on core expansions? Because we didn't really discuss it. I mean, we've discussed it, but we didn't really vote on it. And this proposal's going into a bond, so when do we weigh in on that?
Well, this kind of goes back to what the board did adopt, and that's the board's desire is to have a new school in Riverstone, not the additions. We're running everything aground that we possibly can to find a piece of property. If we cannot do that, then we will come back to the board with the recommendation to go into Part B that was also approved by the board to do the additions. It did not specifically address core when the board approved it, but the expectation would be, as we're doing at any other addition at this point, to include core, and that's why I think the board's, what they approved was wise, because we're budgeting for the new school, even though we knew the additions would be substantially less, but that leaves the capacity, that almost $20 million, to make sure there's adequate funding for the core at each of those schools.
So are we sure that that's adequate funding to increase the core at each of those schools?
I feel confident that it is, but we will definitely look at those numbers before we bring it back to you.
I think I would like to see that, because I know we've gotten some estimates on construction additions in general. I think it would be important to make sure we get that right, because I don't want to put additions on that the core can't handle for the kids. Okay, I think that's it for now. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mrs. Towson. Mr. George.
Yeah, once again, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I have a couple of questions. One is actually from page number 5, the special education security cameras. That is actually we are trying to be compliant with a state mandate, right?
Yes, sir.
Which is not funded, unfunded mandate. So
Yes.
how much we spend, since we have a state rep in-house, just for the information, how much we spend on that unfunded mandate approximately?
So far,
So the 2016-27 school year was a partial year, and we spent about $29,000 on the cameras and the installation. Now, that does not include the cabling and the installation of cabling to those. In 2017-2018, we had 49 new cameras that were installed. We reused 10 cameras that were still good, that weren't being used in other places, so we didn't have to buy new cameras. Those all came out of a contract that we already had. So so roughly we've spent about $100,000 so far. Okay. On the cameras.
Okay, and this particular 2.5 million, I assume it's split into two pieces, into two phases. Is that specifically for the new facilities, or it's for?
No, it's district-wide.
Yeah. District-wide.
Yes, sir.
Okay, okay, and another question I have from, I'm done with that, thank you. And another question I have is about Riverstone, you're finding land. So they don't have a lot of land there. So how long it take us to find whether there is land or not?
We should be coming to y'all very shortly. We've definitely searched high and low, and we should be able to come back to you before we come in August to let you know what
before we vote on
Correct.
the bond? Okay, okay. And okay, another question from page 11, the per student. Just a clarification, is that our whole bond package, assuming we issued that's when it's going to be 19,000 per student, or?
yes, sir. Yes, sir. That's so at the time we were projecting, going through various scenarios, and we thought, I mean, if we had a bond of 1.25 billion, that with cash issuance through 2026, we thought we'd end up with that amount. Okay. Using our enrollment projections and also, our projections for outstanding balance. And so once we finalize our assumptions, then we'll recalculate all of these benchmarking slides.
Okay, okay. And another question I have on page number 22, just curiosity question. Assuming we are going to go ahead with the 1.7 billion bond, and what is there any calculation done? What is our tax rate look like, assuming we do it today, because a lot of things can change over the years.
Certainly, there's a lot, and so just I didn't put in the prior slides for that, showing the whole amount.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think you could count on another 3 or 4 pennies.
Yeah,
Just
okay.
depending.
Sure.
Just depending on what happens, but hopefully it won't be that much. And
Sure.
but like I answered with when Mr. Rice asked the question, we'll certainly have a lot more clarity whenever we come back in 2021.
Sure.
For that bond.
And I just want you to know that thank you for thinking and presenting this two-phase in the bond program. I would have been very uncomfortable voting on a $1.7 billion dollar bond. So
Yes, sir.
thank you for that thought process, and I'm sure we are continue to listen from the community and bond oversight committee and all those people's input. And thank you for the final presentation. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. Burdine. So, Mr. Perez and Mr. Bassett, I appreciate your effort in putting this presentation together, and I echo a lot of what my colleagues have said in the sense of I feel much better about this two-phased approach, partially from a financial perspective, but also from a planning perspective, because some of our struggles were in trying to look through a crystal ball, and that's really very difficult to do in terms of growth in our community and growth in our legislative sessions and all the other factors that play into us making plans. So I appreciate the two-phase approach. I think it's a good one. I also want to reiterate my colleagues who've mentioned about the core expansion. When we have audience members who talk about elementary schools having to have no talking during lunch or in the hallways, I think that's very difficult for very young children. And I don't want to have any facilities where we have kids have to have silent lunch because the numbers are too big in the common spaces that they're not allowed to speak. I think that's unhealthy for children, and I think that we need to be sure that we plan appropriately for the whole child. So I'd like to be sure that I agree with Mrs. Tossan, and I'd like to see what those numbers look like so that we can plan appropriately. And I think that that's true at all levels. I've been in middle schools where they're having silent lunch for the same reason, and I don't think that that's appropriate either, because they don't even have a recess that they can go to afterwards. And then my last question is a little bit more specific. I was trying to understand the deferred principal. Now, is that we use the deferred, or we've used deferred principal in the past through the commercial paper program? Is that an example of deferred principal, or is it an entirely different thing?
Ms. James, that's an entirely different thing. So,
Okay.
so the issuing of commercial paper is just short-term debt that gets refunded rather quickly. The deferment of principal is when you actually plan on not paying off any principal during a period of time, and so but you are paying the interest on a current basis. Okay, and
Okay.
so that's really the difference.
Okay, thank you. I understand what that is. So that's okay for a short term, but if we anticipate continuing periods of needing to issue debt, then we could run ourselves into a little bit of difficulty if we continue to, if our strategy is to defer principal.
No, that's correct. I mean, it wouldn't be my first choice, and so but trying to put together scenarios, for folks to look at, I think it's likely that we could do some, but again, we want to take advantage of the outstanding debt structure that we have, but keeping an eye on the future that we are going to have bonds in the future, and
Right.
so this will not be the last bond And even 2021 will not be the last bond for Fort Bend ISD.
Okay, so I think that's to me, that's an important piece to what everybody else has been saying. Let's be sure we think about that as we're planning, because we can't just plan for 3 years. We know that financially, so we have to think a little bit longer term. And I guess the other thing I'd like to know is when we look at a chart like this, and I can't remember this information, but when is at what point is PASA predicting our build out or our point of, student growth leveling? And I mean, you might not have that now, but we could maybe look into that. I'm just wondering that because to me that fits into the whole concept of how we have to plan for our debt in the future. So, and I too sent in some more specific questions, which I'll get offline. But thank you for the presentation, for all the information. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Mr. Rosenthal.
So just to clarify what Ms. James was saying, it's basically like a zero interest-only loan is what you're doing, in a way.
Yes, sir, if you want to look at it that way.
When
yes,
people
sir.
do that, it's when they're kind of, a little bit cash-strapped, and they're hoping that their property appreciates, right? And then when they sell it, they have the principal to pay off. In this case, we're kind of just hoping to get through some of those years, right, where you're kind of above the line, and then you start paying off the principal.
Really, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, what we're trying to do is, I mean, you could see those drops in our existing debt in the year 2030, and then in 2034. In terms of taking advantage of that capacity, in those years, but doing it in a prudent way. Not totally selling out in that regard. I mean, some districts have to do that, and they even capitalize interest to stay under 50 pennies. Now, we're way below 50 pennies. That's not something we have to worry about. But, again, what we're trying to do is minimize the impact to our taxpayers and taking advantage of the assets that we have at our disposal.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. I wanted to thank the both of you for this presentation and all the information, and I also wanted to thank my fellow board members for the questions and the comments that were made. I, too, am happy with the two-phase approach. I think that we are all concerned about how the community was going to feel about such a large bond number. I feel like this makes it much more appeasing, for lack of better terms. I had just a few questions. A few of them were already answered by previous questions answered by board members, but I know we're doing a capacity audit right now. This could impact some of the things in the bond. Do we have an estimation on when we might be able to get the numbers for that?
Yes, sir. We already have a scheduled meeting for next week on Tuesday to pull in some folks to take a look at the data with us that we've already audited, and then we'll be bringing that to the board also so that you can have that information before a decision is made.
Okay. So we anticipate it'll be before the August the 6th meeting?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much. I also wanted to say that a few of us were able to sit down and go basically line for line with this bond and what's being asked. And as we go through and try to figure out what we can cut and what we can put off or just change the price, we're talking HVAC systems and roof leaks. There's nothing fun in here. There's no Taj Mahals. There's no football stadiums. This is need, and it's crucial that we get this bond passed so that we can not only stay up with our times but just stay afloat. So anyhow, once again, thanks for the presentation. Next up is our disaster procurement update. Dr. Dupree.
Mr. Perez, can you provide an update, please, for this month?
Yes, sir. This will be very quick. Also, there has not been any change since the last 2 months. I reported last month there was not a change, and there has not been a change this month.
Thank you, Mr. Perez. We will now convene in closed session under the Texas Open Meetings Act, Chapter 551, and those sections listed in the agenda, and for the purpose of private consultation with the board's attorney on any or all subject matters authorized by law. We are now convened in closed session. Mrs. James, we have our policy committee report. You want to go with that? Oh, excuse me. Board member reports, Mr. Rosenthal. Sorry about that.
Yes, sir. So, this month, the board has met at a TASB summer board meeting, or some board members attended. Go Public Gulf Coast meeting, policy committee meetings. Woo. Fort Bend Chamber, State of Higher Education, LTASB final session, and TASB SLI Fort Worth, Safety and Security Committee, and Press Day CTE Center.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. I wanted to just say a quick thank you to Mrs. Sofer for the press day. That was a really, really neat event, and I feel like it was effective and it gave the opportunity for a lot of press outlets to ask questions and see what we're doing out there. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. Next up is our policy committee report. Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. Rodine. Before I talk about the policy committee report, I'd also like to add a note of congratulations to Mr. Rice as he was elected as the new first vice president of TASB. So do you want me to come down? Can you put those slides up? Do you want me to come down there, or how can I? Do we have an advancer button? Will it work from here? So I wanted to give you, or I should say Dave and I, but I'm carrying the heavy bucket tonight, give you an update on the policy committee, because we've been working really hard on the policy committee this year, and I want to give you all an overview of it so you can realize what all we're doing. In general, the committee members are Dave and I, Dr. Dupree, Mrs. Martinez, Dr. Evans was on our committee, and she's resigned from the district, so I imagine we'll be finding someone else to fill that spot. And then we have E-team members attend or executive directors as necessary, depending on the policy that we're discussing and what the topic is. And we also always have a representative from legal there. Often Kobe Wilbanks, but sometimes Mr. Scamardo is there as well. This is a picture of our strategic framework, and I put it in this slide because this is our work. This is the work that the board has put together, and it's tremendously helpful in guiding the work of the committee. It gives us a document to go back to, and helps the how it works in the committee is that Dave and I end up kind of interpreting it for the staff, whatever staff might be there in attendance with whichever policy we're working on. So it's kind of awesome. So I put it up there on the slide just to reinforce, really our hard work. Our policy review process, we start about 2 months ahead, and we review, as you know, nearly every meeting. We have 4 to 6 policies that are coming to us. Each set of policies that come to the board, it takes about 2 full committee meetings to work through. They undergo at least 1 legal review, I think probably more than that. And as I said, we have a legal representation in our meetings. They also get reviewed by E-team. And then we generally have 2 or 3 conversations either between Dave and I, or Dave and I and Charles by telephone or email, or sometimes at McDonald's. Dave's choice. To just refine everything. But we are working on this process to try to make it a little bit more efficient, because that's a lot of man hours for every single policy. So we're working on that, and I hope to get it a little bit better as time as time goes by. We have a website that's pretty involved. We've got our policies posted up there. We've got a timeline. We've got a tracking document for everything. We try to track the policy as it exists now and all the different versions of it. And this is kind of still evolving because we haven't gotten even all our meetings posted up there. In other words, we're not all listed out. So it's kind of still under development. Just so you can know how well we're doing, we've done the board in the last year and a half has done nearly 100 policies, revised 100 local policies. 94 is the number. That's pretty exciting. We've done this past school year, 28 local policies that have incorporated, and the primary difference in that group is that they've incorporated the new board goals in that set of policies. So we're starting to shift the mindset, really, of how we're approaching education, and that's where one of the ways it's evidenced. One of the things we really need to work on is the policy recommendations that came out of the 2013 curriculum audit. We've not done a good job in addressing all of those policies. So for this upcoming year, that's something that we'd like to sort of finish up. But besides that, we've gotten the internal audit policies that have come up from that. We've gotten all of that there taken care of, and the legal ones, as becomes necessary, we've gotten those as well. So our next steps are to maintain or increase the pace through refining the process, not to make it more burdensome on all of us, but to make the process a little bit better. We absolutely need to address the things in the curriculum audit that's overdue. Governance policies are listed there because Dave and I feel it's really important that we capture what this board is doing right and document it and memorialize it in our governance policies. So we're working on that. And then the E-Series is the instruction series, and obviously that's a focus of our district work. We want to align to our new goals and really shift the way we do education in Fort Bend ISD and really emphasize the student ownership because we think that's the best path forward. So as we've all discussed. So I think that covers all the things I wanted to say. So does anybody have any questions?
Mrs. Tolsan?
I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to thank the two of you for being on that committee. When I was the board president, it was one of the committees that I thought was really important, and the two of you have served very well and done a really good job of streamlining the work for the board. So I just want to say thank you for all your hard work, because that is really hard, tedious work.
Thank you, Mrs. Tolsan.
I love it, Mrs. Tolsan.
What she said.
Thank you, Mr. Rice. So as the new board president, I chose both of them to continue on that committee because of your hard work that you do. And as a lot of you may know, that part of our job as trustees is to review and create policy. This is an extremely important part of the job that we do. And we have a lot of trust and faith in the both of you, and we appreciate your hard work. So please continue that as we move forward. We will now consider our consent agenda. Does anyone want to remove any items from the consent agenda?
Yes. Yes, there's an item around Centerpoint Energy, I believe.
10F1.
There it goes, yes, 10F1. If you can
And I'd like to also remove 10F4A.
All right. Anyone else? May I have a motion?
Mr. Burdine, I move to approve the consent agenda in its entirety, with the exception of 10F1 and 10F4A as presented.
Second.
A motion by Mr. Rice and a second by Mrs. Tossan. May we have discussion?
Yes.
Mr. Rosenthal.
A couple questions. On 10E, the E1A, I should say. Those vendors that we're looking at to evaluate programs, they don't have any relationships with the programs that they're evaluating, correct? As far as we know?
It's Beth. Hi. As far as we know, there are no relationships with any of the programs that they are evaluating. They're outside third-party.
Okay.
Entities.
And do we feel like that that using outside vendors is more efficient, rather than tying up, all admin's time, trying to evaluate these programs? That we feel like we'll get, better decisions, better data.
It gives objective
Right,
data
more
because
objective,
not
right.
internal.
Right.
Not to imply that anyone would be intentionally not objective, but it does assure that objectivity, and it creates capacity that we may not have in current and existing staff or numbers on the teams.
Okay. Okay. That was that question. And then on, let's see, 10F4, Bond 2014, 4A, I should say, and I've seen this in several places looking through that bond list. Oh, she pulled it. Never mind. Great. Thank you for pulling that.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. May I have a motion?
We already had the motion there.
We're having
sorry.
discussion. No, because I'd like to have some discussion, please.
Mrs. James, excuse me.
That's okay. Okay, so I have a question. I had sent in a comment earlier on the board operating procedures, and I don't know if it got updated about the non-release of personal information. Is that?
Yes, ma'am, it did.
Okay.
Veronica, where is that?
It's on the last page.
Okay, it's on 19. I see that.
Yes, on page 19, we highlighted that last bullet to reference the document
Okay.
and its location in the superintendent's office.
Okay. Okay, and then I had sent in a couple of other questions. Were the answers sent, those things sent out already? No, okay. So, all right, thank you. I just wondered about that. What's that? We did get them?
I believe you did get them.
No, we didn't.
No, the board response memo will be finalized and sent to you all tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you. My question, one of the things I'd asked is about, similar to what Mr. Rosenthal was bringing up about program evaluation, so I was wondering about where we were headed with that. I think it's a great idea to outsource this, and I just wanted to follow up on that. So I'll wait for the memo, and then we can discuss it. I don't believe I have any other questions then on these items.
May I please clarify? Mrs. James, you mentioned the board operating procedures questions you had submitted, and we provided responses to the questions that you submitted in May, when it was first on the agenda. But I think she was referring to questions she submitted this afternoon. Thank you for clarification. Yes.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Please vote. Motion passes. We will now consider item 10F1.
Mr. Radine, I move to approve item 10F1, CenterPoint Energy blanket easement for elementary school 51 as presented.
Second.
Motion by Mrs. James, second by Mr. Rice. Do we have any discussion?
I'm abstaining.
Thank you, Mrs. Haliger. Please vote. Motion passes. We will now consider item 10F4A. May I have a motion?
Mr. Burdine, I move to approve item 10, or move to approve item 10-4A as presented.
Second.
Motion by Mrs. James and a second by Mr. Rice. Do we have discussion?
Yes.
Mr. Rosenthal.
So, apparently this was caused by some holes and some leakage and whatnot, reading the memo on this. It sounded like the way it was phrased, that maybe things weren't done right, maybe during the construction or some other job. Is there any way to recover some of that?
Yes, sir, there's a possibility. The school was built in 2001, so it's past the 10-year limitation, but it doesn't mean that we, cannot look at that. But what happened, if you recall, we had come to y'all previously to go ahead and remove the gym floors. Once they were removed, that we found that there was failed flashing that needed to be replaced, which required that we remove X amount of courses of brick, put the flashing, and re-waterproof, and that's what this is for. But yes, sir, we can definitely, look into that.
Because it sounds like there's a whole bunch of items that sound similar to this in that bond list that we have, been given. So I don't know if it's like some kind of pandemic or if that's the right word, but anyway, okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosenthal. Mrs. James?
Okay, so I'm trying to remember a little bit of the history of this. So this wasn't so this wasn't related to the hurricane. This wasn't related to the hurricane.
No,
water
ma'am. We
damage.
did have some water come in during the hurricane, but the issue was there. And what we replaced in the prior item that we brought to y'all, we came in, we replaced gutters that were failing. There was water getting behind the gutters and coming in, and then we also replaced the gym floor that had been damaged. But once they removed it, they realized that even with those repairs, if we didn't repair this section down at the bottom, there was water intrusion at that point. So we would be putting a new gym floor, and we'd have water right back in. So that's what we're addressing.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. James. Please vote. Motion passes. We do not have any action items, so next we're going to review our future board meeting, Dr. Dupree.
Yes, sir. So in August, we're going to be discussing student behavior, discipline management. We're also going to be giving an update on the Co-Teach Collaborative Special Education Teaching Arrangement, kind of a 2-year progress report, and have 2 internal audit reports, one on special education audit and one on human resources follow-up audit by Gibson. We're also going to seek action on the Student Code of Conduct, and we're going to ask you to call a November bond election in August, as we've discussed this evening, along with several other fiscal strategy related items. And then there's a number of policies we're currently planning to have on the agenda, pending my follow-up with the committee to make sure we're going to be able to achieve that goal. So we'll see if that happens or not. But other than that, that's what we've got.
Thank you, Dr. Dupree. May I have a motion to adjourn?
I move that we adjourn.
Meeting adjourned.